Chapter 7. First Year, Marauders. Wednesday the 15th of September, 1971. The next morning, James and Sirius could barely contain their excitement and hurried their dorm mates down to breakfast before any of the other Gryffindors. They were the first students to reach the Great Hall, other than a few Ravenclaws bent over their new revision books with huge mugs of black coffee. "Perfect!" Sirius beamed at the empty benches. "Front row seats." "Bet no one shows up for hours," Peter groaned, half asleep, propped up on his elbows. "Oh, cheer up." James poured them all large mugs of tea. "Don't you want to see the fruits of our labour?" "Not at 6 in the morning," Peter replied, slurping his tea. Sirius winced at the sound and pushed a plate towards him. "Have some toast and stop whinging." Remus took some toast too, and cut it into 4 pieces. He spread marmalade onto 1/4, jam onto another, butter on the third, and lemon curd on the last. He ignored the look of amusement Sirius was giving him. Remus had never had so much choice before, and was determined to make the most of every meal. Fortunately, they didn't have to wait too long before the other students began to trickle in for breakfast. The first Slytherins arrived just as Remus was finishing his toast. 3 boys and 2 girls, 3rd years. They walked over to their table, quite unaware of the 4 eager Gryffindors watching them intently. For a few moments, it was as if nothing was different. Sirius sighed in disappointment. But then, the tallest boy shuffled slightly in his seat, rubbing his arm. Another seemed to be looking for something in his pocket, but from Remus's viewpoint, he was clearly scratching his leg furiously. The third kept using his wand to rub behind his ear. "It worked," James whispered, breathless with excitement. Even Peter looked cheerful now. As more and more Slytherins filtered in, their problem became more obvious and more hilarious. By 7 o'clock, the Slytherin table was full of squirming, withering, scratching boys and horrified-looking girls. Amicus Carrow, a burly 6-year, eventually ripped off his robes, his school jumper, and even his tie to claw at his chest, which Remus could see was already red raw. He almost felt sorry for them. But then Snape came in. Whether it was karma or sheer luck, Severus seemed to have reacted particularly badly to the rose-hip seeds. He walked in with his head bowed, hair falling over his face, but his nose was still visible and clearly bright red. "Oh, Merlin!" Sirius wheezed, laughing so hard he was holding his stomach. "Tell me we got his face!" "Oi, Snivellus!" James yelled out suddenly to get the other boys' attention. Snape spun around, looking up, his hair parted. The left side of his face was covered in an angry red rash, from his temples all the way down to his neck, disappearing under his uniform. His left eye was red too, the lid swollen and irritated. "Looking good," Sirius crowed, and all 4 boys dissolved into giggles as Snape stormed out of the room. By the time breakfast was over, the entire castle was buzzing with rumours about what exactly had come over the Slytherin boys. Sirius and James looked as though all their Christmases had come at once, and even Peter had cheered up remarkably, reminding them all that he had kept lookout after all, making the entire venture possible. "It was all Lupin's idea, though," Sirius returned, slapping Remus heartily on the back. "What shall we do to celebrate, huh? Exploding snap? Raid the kitchens?" Remus shook Sirius off, smiling politely. "Well, whatever you're doing, do it without me," he replied. "I've got double detention." "From Slughorn?" "Yeah, and McGonagall, and Flitwick, but that's tomorrow. Then my herbology detention is over the weekend." "Bloody hell, mate," James frowned. "You going for a record or something?" Remus shrugged. He was always being punished at St. Edmund's, all the boys were. Detention didn't bother him, though exploding snap did sound like a lot of fun. "Maybe you'd better start doing your homework," Sirius said gently. Remus rolled his eyes, getting up from the table. "Come on," he said. It's Defense Against the Dark Arts first. Thought you two loved that. Later that day, Remus was on his way to detention with Slughorn when he ran into Lily Evans. He was perfectly happy to keep walking, but she smiled and fell into step with him. "Hiya, Remus." "Hi. Are you going to the dungeons?" He nodded. "Me too. I have to tell Slughorn that Severus can't make his detention." "Oh, right." "Did you hear what happened to the Slytherins?" "Yeah." Everyone had heard. It was all they'd been talking about all day, even during lessons. Fortunately, no one had had a clue who'd done it. It had been a good idea, attacking the entire house at once. Who could guess who the target had been? "Crazy, isn't it?" Lily continued. "Poor Sev, he was allergic to whatever they used. Madame Pomfrey gave him a sleeping draught while the swelling goes down." Remus sniggered without thinking. He glanced at Lily, who was looking back at him with reproachful green eyes. She shook her head. "Look, I know he isn't very nice to you. The other day in potions or on the train, he's a bit of a snob, okay?" Remus snorted. "But I wanted to say sorry," Lily pressed on. "I need to stand up to him more. Shouldn't let him get away with it. He's actually a really nice person when you get to know him." "If you say so." Remus stopped walking. They were outside Slughorn's office now. The door was closed, and there were raised voices on the other side. "Horace, whoever it was, they must have been a Slytherin." It was Professor McGonagall. "Who else has the password?" "Why would a Slytherin attack their own house, Minerva?" The potions master sounded furious. "You did say it was only the boys' dorms affected. Perhaps it was one of the girls." "Really?" "Well, who else? Peeves? He never enters the common rooms. Doesn't enter the dungeons either, come to that. Too frightened of the Bloody Baron." "We should place a ban on all Zonko's products." "From what Poppy says, it wasn't a Zonko's product. Rosehip from the greenhouses." Lupin felt a trickle of fear run down his spine. If they knew that much, would they be able to find out who'd done it? "Rosehip, huh? Very clever." Slughorn actually sounded impressed. McGonagall sighed. "I suppose you'd like to blame the Ravenclaws now?" "I just wish I knew who'd done it," he sighed heavily. "Perhaps the truth will out. I suppose it does seem more likely that it was one of the Slytherin girls than a gang of marauders creeping into the dungeons under the cloak of night with malicious intent." Remus could hear Slughorn's chuckle at that. "Yes, quite." "Now, I must be going," McGonagall was saying, her footsteps approaching the door. "You will let me know if you catch the culprit." The door swung open. Remus and Lily stepped back guiltily. McGonagall looked down at them through her spectacles. "What are 2 Gryffindors doing so far from their tower?" "Please, Professor, Remus and I were only—" "Ah!" Slughorn cut off Lily's nervous rambling. "Lupin, my boy, and Miss Evans. Come to offer Snape's apology, huh? No need, dear girl, no need. With everything going on today, I think we can cancel the boys' detentions for now." He came to the door and looked down at Remus severely. "If it is understood that there will be no more fighting in my classes, or any classes, for that matter, "Yes, Professor." Remus nodded solemnly, trying not to look too pleased. "Excellent," Slughorn beamed, locking the door to his office. "Then, if you'll excuse me, I've some inquiries to make." Remus and Lily had almost made it to the end of the hall when McGonagall suddenly called out, "Mr. Lupin!" Remus's heart sank. "Yes, Professor McGonagall?" "That isn't to say that your detention with me has been cancelled. Come along now, we'll get an early start." McGonagall had him doing lines for an hour. Not too bad, considering he was used to canings at St. Edmund's. He didn't mind copying and repetition. It was soothing. I will complete all assignments set. Perhaps he'd swallow his pride next time and copy James's homework, or Peter's, if he didn't want to look too suspicious. But he knew that James would eventually want to know why Remus never read the set text, and if he told them, and he was equally as sure that James and Sirius would try to get him to go and explain to Professor McGonagall. Both boys had unerring faith in the teachers of Hogwarts. Remus, however, had never met an adult he trusted. She'd have him sent back to St. Edmund's at once. What good was an illiterate wizard to anyone? Once his detention was finished, he climbed through the portrait hole and into the common room to find his 3 roommates waiting for him. Peter and James were engaged in a very serious-looking game of chess. Of course the pieces were moving. Everything seemed to bloody move in this castle. Well, Sirius was listening to one of his records through a very posh-looking set of brand-new headphones. Remus was dying to have a listen, but he hadn't worked up the courage to ask yet. He sat down next to Sirius quietly. The long-haired boy pulled his headphones off at once. "That was quick." "Only had one to do in the end," Remus explained. "Slughorn let me off, too busy trying to sort out the itching powder thing." Sirius grinned broadly, leaning back onto the couch with his arms folded under his head. "That prank is the gift that just keeps on giving." "Snape was allergic and everything," Remus said, smirking. "That ginger girl said he's been in the hospital wing all day." Sirius laughed even louder. His eyes grew bright when he laughed. Remus had never seen anyone exhibit such pure joy. It made you want to punch him and be his friend all at the same time. "Which ginger girl?" James looked up suddenly. "Checkmate!" Peter cried. "You know, the annoying one, Evans." "I don't think she's annoying." "Okay," Remus shrugged. "Let's not talk about girls." Remus rolled his eyes. "This might be the most important day of our lives. This is the day we became legends, the day our friendship was forged in the fire of itching powder." "They don't know it was us, do they?" Peter asked nervously, tidying away his chess set. Remus shook his head. "Slughorn reckons it was a Slytherin girl, or a gang of Marauders." "Marauders!" Sirius sat up suddenly. "That's it! Raise your glasses, boys." "We don't have glasses," James replied, amused. "Well, just pretend." Sirius shook his head irritably. "From this day forward, we are the Marauders." He said this with such a dramatic flourish that it could have only been followed by a stunned silence. James was grinning, Peter glancing at him for direction, not quite understanding what was going on, and Remus burst out laughing. "What sort of Ponzi gang name is that?" Chapter 8. First Year Secrets. Tuesday, the 5th of October, 1971. The next full moon passed much as the first had. This time the wolf had clearly grown restless because Remus awoke with a number of deep scratches. "They heal fast with a bit of antiseptic," he advised Madame Pomfrey, who fussed over him in the chill morning light. "And faster still with magic," she smiled, with a flourish of her wand. The cuts closed up almost instantly. Remus stared, amazed. "Can you get rid of scars too?" he asked eagerly. She shook her head sadly. "No, Remus, not these ones. I'm sorry." "It's okay," he sighed, dressing for school. This time he'd brought a change of clothes with him and left them in the tunnel just outside the shack to avoid having to go back to the tower this time. He'd meet the other boys in their first lesson and let them wonder where he'd been. "You don't have to go to school today," Madame Pomfrey was saying. "Not if you're too tired. I can write you a note." "I want to go," he replied. "It's not that bad, honestly." Pomfrey looked at him with serious eyes. "Not that bad for now. I'm afraid the transformations may start to take their toll as you grow up." "Have you looked after other kids like me then?" He'd been wanting to ask for ages, but wasn't sure how. "No, dear. You're the first Hogwarts student that I know of who's been bitten." "Who's been bitten?" she accepted gratefully. "But I promise I know what I'm doing. I've done plenty of reading on the subject. You mean there are books about people like me? Well, yes. She sounded surprised. She sat down on the bed as he finished dressing. You could borrow one of them, if you like. He thought about it, then shook his head. They had Transfiguration first thing, but McGonagall didn't give him detention for not bringing his homework. She had obviously decided to be more lenient around the full moon. She did make him promise to bring it with him next time, and he agreed, hoping he sounded sincere. James, Sirius and Peter spent half of their lesson trying to get his attention, but he steadfastly ignored them until McGonagall threatened to separate all four of them. In the halls, on their way to Charms, Remus knew there was no escape. It was a good 5-minute walk. So, where were you? Sirius blurted out, walking on his left side. Nowhere, he replied, trying to hurry on. Oh, go on, James pleaded, coming up on his right side. Tell us. Was it the same place you went last month? Maybe. Were you in detention again? Asked Peter, struggling to keep up. Remus cursed himself for not having thought of that. Detention would have been the perfect cover. Nope. Then where... Watch it, Half-Blood. Remus had been too busy evading questions to look where he was going, and run smack into Snape, who was coming round the corner. Already wound up, Remus squared his shoulders and attempted to push past roughly. Watch yourself, Snivellus. Snape didn't move, and pushed him instead. Mulciber appearing at his left shoulder, looming menacingly at the smaller boys. I know that it was you that broke into our dorms the other night. All of you, he hissed. Yeah? Prove it, James smirked, folding his arms. Snape's lips curled. I can't yet, but I will. I'll get you back too, I promise. We're quaking in our boots, Sirius replied, leaning against the wall as if he was bored. Now would you kindly move it? Your idea, was it, Black? Snape drawled. Or yours, Potter? Had to have been one of you. Pettigrew doesn't have the guts, and dear Lupin here clearly hasn't got the brains. Remus clenched his fists. He could sneeze Snape's hand on his wand. Severus probably knew all sorts of curses and hexes. James had taught Remus one or two, but he was too blind with rage to remember any of them now. Move along now, gentlemen, a sharp voice suddenly rang out over the corridor. It was Professor Flitwick, stepping out of his classroom to see what the hold-up was. Severus, you're clogging up the halls, and you four are supposed to be in my class. Come along. Remus felt overheated and agitated for the rest of Charms, which was usually his favourite lesson. It relied more on practical work with his wand than reading or writing, and he often did better than even Sirius or James. Finding it difficult to calm down, he kept shooting his cushions across the room like missiles, rather than guiding them carefully through the hoops Flitwick had hung from the ceiling. They had been working on levitation charms for a few weeks now, and Peter was the only one still struggling. In Remus's opinion, Peter's problem was a lack of imagination. James and Sirius were both unerringly confident, and he found that confidence was all you needed to complete most basic spells. Remus himself generally felt able to complete any task if it looked simple enough. Peter, on the other hand, worried about everything. He read and reread his textbooks, trying to copy the complicated diagrams there, rather than just copy what Flitwick showed them. I expect you will all be able to levitate this book by the end of the week, Flitwick said at the end of the lesson. The book was enormous, about half the size of the tiny professor, and looked as though a fully grown man might have had trouble carrying it very far. So come prepared for a quick test of your abilities. Peter groaned as they collected their things to leave. Remus had managed to calm down by lunchtime, but still had trouble controlling his magic later in the afternoon, and was glad when they only had herbology and history of magic. He wondered whether it was his temper, which had always been short, or whether it was the full moon. He always had a lot of energy after transformation, even before he knew he could do magic. Now his wand buzzed in his hand like the static in a TV aerial. He tried a quick Lumos, hiding in a toilet cubicle between lessons, and nearly burnt his retinas out. Perhaps the book Madame Pomfrey had mentioned might tell him more about it, but he'd never know now. There might be other books in the library, but he hadn't checked. He knew the word well enough, and could spell it out if he concentrated hard. But he didn't dare. Remus lived in fear that if he wrote it down, or said it out loud, that somehow everyone would find out his secret, and it was just better to keep stuff like that in your head. Thursday, 7th of October, 1971. It was especially important to keep his secrets to himself now, because Remus was being watched by McGonagall, who still raised an eyebrow when she saw he wasn't taking notes, by Madame Pomfrey, who was always trying to get him to stop by the hospital wing for a quick check-over, and by Snape, who was still furious that he couldn't figure out how the itching powder incident had happened. Remus might have been able to bear all of these interferences if it wasn't for a fourth person observing him. This stalker was much subtler, much less direct in his surveillance, but noticeable nonetheless. Sirius. At first, Remus had thought the other boy was just nosy, part of that entitlement he and James shared. They had to know everything about everybody. They were constantly telling Remus and Peter other people's business. So-and-so's father was turned down from a promotion at the ministry years ago, and that's why they have a chip on their shoulder. Marana Thump's great-aunt was once under investigation for the illegal use of love potion, and now no one ever drank tea at the Thurps' house. Professor Slughorn knew more about the dark arts than he let on, and the Slug Club was notorious for turning out dark wizards with influence. Of course, neither of them knew anything at all about Remus, and in the beginning he assumed that this was why Sirius was so watchful. But he never asked any direct questions, and if he was curious about Lupin's family or upbringing, then it was a private interest that James didn't share. James rarely watched other people. Remus had noticed. He preferred other people to be watching him. No one else seemed to notice, thankfully. Sirius was sly in that respect. Only very occasionally Remus managed to catch him, unaware, staring intently with those deep blue eyes. He didn't even have the shame to look away when he was caught, only softened his gaze into a friendly smile, which Remus was obliged to return. That Thursday, they were finishing their homework in the Gryffindor common room. Well, James was finishing Remus's homework, having completed his own. He'd offered to do it in return for Remus teaching him the Obscurate spell, and despite his pride, Remus had acquiesced. He really didn't want another detention with McGonagall, and James was good at imitating other people's handwriting. Sirius was completing his own essay, and had already written 3 inches extra on the uses of lacewing flies in transformative drafts, plus diagrams. There were books strewn all over the table they'd claimed for themselves, along with inkwells and scrunched-up rolls of parchment. Peter was trying to levitate an apple and get it into a waste paper basket 4 feet away. So far, he could get it up into the air, but then it wobbled and fell back down. Frazzled, Peter ran his fingers through his hair again and consulted his text. "You'll get it, Pete, don't worry," James murmured, not looking up from Remus's paper. "Keep at it." "I'm trying," Peter whinged. "I'm sure it's the movement I'm getting wrong. The book says to use a smooth serpentine action. But I'm not sure." He swirled his wand in the air. Remus tutted. "It's not like that," he said bluntly. "It's like an S shape on its side. Look." He performed the spell, effortlessly lifting the apple into the air and sending it sailing into the bin neatly. "An S shape? Are you sure?" Peter frowned. He aimed his own wand at a scrunched-up ball of paper from the table. "Wingardium Leviosa," he chanted, waving his hand in the same way Lupin had. Sure enough, the paper flew shakily upwards, then flew with slightly less grace into the bin, bouncing off the sides as it fell to the bottom and landed beside the apple. Peter stared wide-eyed. "I did it!" he gasped. "An S shape! Why didn't it just say that in the book?" Well done, Pete, James said, looking up and smiling. He took off his glasses and rubbed his eyes. You should be a teacher, Remus. Lupin snorted, looking away bashfully. James continued. I'm nearly done with this. Just need to check something. Can you pass me Magical Theory, the waffling book? Remus felt a cold shiver run down his spine. Trying not to panic, he looked down at the pile of books James was pointing at. One of them was definitely about potions. It had a cauldron on the cover. The other, it was anyone's guess. The gold and silver lettering on each cover seemed to shift and swirl before his eyes. Was it better just to pick one up, even if it was the wrong one? He looked back at James, desperately, who was reading over what he'd written. Peter was too busy levitating more balls of paper to notice Remus's turmoil. He looked down again, biting his lip. Sirius cleared his throat quietly and leaned across the desk. He silently tapped one of the books with his forefinger without looking at Remus. It was a big black leather-bound tome, which Remus recognized vaguely. Gratefully, he snatched it up and handed it to James. Cheers, mate, James said, absent-mindedly, returning to his work. Sirius carried on as if nothing had happened. Remus felt his cheeks burning. Chapter 9. First Year. Scars. Friday the 15th of October, 1971. Remus had to spend the next few days avoiding Sirius, or at least avoiding being alone with him. This wasn't easy. The boys spent all their time together, especially on the weekends. They all got through the Friday charms lesson with no trouble, even Peter. Flitwick was so thrilled that the entire class had mastered levitation so early in the year that he let them out all early for lunch. Sirius made himself unavoidable the very next week, during their flying lesson. If Remus hadn't hated history of magic so much, then flying would have been his least favourite subject. 20 minutes into their very first lesson with Madame Hooch, he had learnt that he was afraid of heights, and the rest of the classes had been miserable for him. James was the star of the class, of course, and even the other Marauders found him insufferable as he flitted around the Quidditch pitch, throwing loops and feints as if he was born on a broom. Sirius was excellent too, and most of the other kids in the class had grown up playing on broomsticks. Even Peter was competent. It had rained the night before, and the ground was soft and muddy. They'd changed out of their usual lace-up shoes and into thick boots and scarlet flying kits before squelching out onto the pitch. They picked up their brooms and awaited instruction. The brooms were provided by the school. First years weren't allowed to bring their own, but James would tell anyone who stopped long enough to listen that he had a top-of-the-line model at home. Right, mount your brooms, please, ladies and gentlemen, Hooch bellowed at the group. Nice strong wind today, so I want you all to take good care. Potter, no showing off. Remus clambered onto his broom, swallowing hard. If he could manage not to be sick, then it would be a victory. I'd like 5 clean laps around the pitch, then a good landing back here from each of you. Mind the puddle, and remember to lean into the wind where possible. Use it to your advantage. 5 points to whoever's back first. And with barely any warning, the silver-haired witch blew her whistle hard. Remus and Lily, the only 2 Muggleborns in the class, were the last off the ground. Once the redhead was in the air, however, she streaked ahead with ease. Bit higher, Lupin. Come on now, Hooch boomed from below, shouting through a megaphone. He wanted to ignore her, but there was no escape. At least back at St. Edmund's, when they made you do cross-country, you could hide around a corner or skive off in town for the afternoon. He pushed himself higher, trying to look ahead and not down, trying to think about anything other than the empty space between himself and the ground. He could see Lily's bright red plait flashing ahead like a fox's tail, Peter's shining blonde hair somewhere towards the middle of the group. Though he couldn't see that far ahead, he knew that James and Sirius were almost neck and neck. Remus just ploughed on grimly, not wanting to go any faster. Who cared if he was last? If he didn't break his neck getting there. As he rounded a corner at the end of the pitch, the wind really hit him, and he tried not to slow down too much, leaning forward. It was so cold, and the grey morning air battered his face. The second lap was as bad as the first. By the third, he noticed that James had taken to circling each of the towers in their empty spectator stands, despite Madame Hooch's admonishments. On the fourth lap, Remus had company. "Having fun?" Sirius grinned, cruising along beside him. He looked so comfortable, as if he could raise both hands over his head, spin upside down and fly backwards without any trouble at all. "What you doing?" Remus frowned, trying to ignore him. "Trying to lose?" "James is going to win," Sirius shrugged. "Might as well let him have his moment. Thought I'd hang out with you." "Why?" Remus replied through gritted teeth. "Thought you might want the company." Remus didn't need to look at him to know that he was grinning that irritating Sirius Black grin. "Plus, we're about to land, and I know you hate landing." "Piss off." "No." "I'm warning you, Black. You can't punch me up here, Lupin, unless you want to let go of your broom." "God, you're annoying." "Yep." Sirius flew up in front of him, then all the way around, a perfect orbit. "Piss off." Remus tried to dodge him, wobbling dangerously. "Time to land. Remember to stick your legs out and lean back. Then bend your knees as you hit the— Ow!" Remus had grabbed the tail of Sirius's broom and given it a hard yank. Laughing, Sirius righted himself, then flew back to Remus's side and gave him a hard shove back. Remus shook, but held on tight, making his descent. It was much smoother than before. He leaned back, then twisted quickly to push Sirius again. "Get out of my way," he yelled, going faster. "You can be the last one down for once." "Oh, no, you don't." Sirius now grabbed Remus's broom tail, laughing, tugging him backwards. This was perhaps a step too far, as they were both quite close to the ground now. The two wrestling boys tumbled towards the earth, brooms flying out from beneath them. They both crash-landed into a huge muddy puddle, skidding and rolling forwards, soaking their robes in the process. "Black, Lupin!" Madame Hooch marched over to the two boys sprawled in the mud. The other Gryffindors gathered round, giggling and pointing. Sirius leapt to his feet, with all of the grace his nobility blessed him with, and pulled Lupin up roughly by the hand. They both looked up at the teacher, blinking water droplets from their eyes. "What did I say about minding the puddle?" Madame Hooch raised an amused eyebrow. She usually saw the fun in things. "A point each from Gryffindor. You'd better go and wash off in the showers. Off you go." They both waddled towards the Quidditch changing rooms, holding out their heavy, waterlogged robes. "Bloody ridiculous kit," Remus grumbled as they stepped into the squat little stone building. "How are we ever going to dry it?" "The house elves will take care of that," Sirius replied, shaking his off and dumping it in a pile in the corner. Remus couldn't be bothered to ask what on earth house elves were. He pulled his own robes off and kicked away his boots, then entered a shower cubicle to continue undressing. There were towels laid out already, and the water was deliciously warm. He leaned forward into the steam, letting it warm his body, watching the mud and rogue blades of grass swirl down the drain. At least he'd got out of 40 more minutes of flying. He scrubbed his hands roughly over his hair. Without Matron's monthly haircuts, his hair was getting longer and softer, sticking straight up most of the time, as messy as James's. He could finally see the colour of it, but was disappointed. It appeared to be a bland, mousy brown. Remus finished in the shower before Sirius got out and looked around for his uniform quickly. He was half-dressed once Sirius finally emerged, his long hair swept back, wet and shining like oil. He was already fully dressed and looked impossibly cool and grown up, while Remus had realised he'd missed a button on his shirt and had to begin all over again. "What's that?" Sirius said suddenly. Remus looked up, then back down. Sirius was pointing to a long silver stripe which stretched from the left half of his collarbone down diagonally across his chest to his right nipple. He fumbled with his buttons, trying to close the shirt faster. "A scar," he muttered. There was no point in saying anything else now. He barely noticed them anymore. They were just there, as much a part of him as his freckles or the fine hairs on his arms. Did it happen to you at the home, where you grew up? There was something odd in Sirius's voice. Remus found he couldn't speak, so he just nodded. Sirius nodded too. "I've got scars," he said, so quietly that Remus thought he'd misheard at first. Sirius bent down and pulled up his trouser leg, turning his ankle to show Remus the marks there. His scars weren't like Remus's, which were big and rough and jagged, full of rage and hunger. The silver stripes on the back of Sirius's leg were thin and straight, uniform in their cruelty. Remus stared for a few seconds before Sirius dropped the edge of the fabric and straightened up. They stared at each other down for a full minute, Remus feeling quite hot, Sirius's eyes cool and calm. Then it broke. "Shall we go and watch James making a prat of himself?" Sirius asked. Remus nodded again, and they both stepped back out into the cold autumn air. They took their seats on the hard benches in the spectators' stands and watched the rest of the class flitting back and forth across the pitch, red robes fluttering behind them. Lily, though lacking James's formal technique, was giving him a run for his money when it came to speed, beating him in 2 out of 3 races between goalposts. "Remus," Sirius said, suddenly as their classmates came in for their final landing. "Yeah?" "You can't read, can you?" Remus sighed. He had enough secrets to keep as it was, and Sirius had shared one of his. "Nah, I won't tell anyone. Cheers." That serious black grin. Chapter 10. First Year History. Saturday, the 23rd of October, 1971. "Did you just never get taught?" Remus shrugged, tired and frustrated. It was a week after the flying lesson, and Sirius had caught him on his own again. He'd been sitting quite happily on his bed, flicking through one of James's Quidditch magazines. He liked the moving pictures. Even if he still didn't understand the rules, it was the closest thing to the telly they had at Hogwarts. "I got taught," he replied, turning the page, hoping Sirius would take the hint and get lost. He didn't. Remus closed the magazine. "I got taught," he repeated. "Just didn't learn properly. When I look at the words, I don't think I see what everyone else does. It doesn't make any sense. All the other letters just keep jumping around and changing. Teacher said I was thick." No one had made much of a fuss about his problems with schoolwork at St. Edmund's. They'd barely had any homework, since no one did it anyway. Lots of the boys had problems. Either they couldn't or wouldn't be taught. It wasn't as if anyone expected much of them, either way. "But how have you been doing it?" Sirius was like a dog with a bone. "Doing what?" "Well, everything. All your work here at Hogwarts." Remus looked at him as if he was the one who was stupid. "Sirius, I haven't been doing it. In case you haven't noticed, I'm in detention every night." "Well, yeah, obviously," Sirius waved a hand. "But the other day, in potions, I saw you. You didn't take any notes, didn't even look at the book or the blackboard, and you still prepared all of the ingredients for the cure for boils perfectly. Slughorn gave you 5 points. Remus felt himself blush at the memory. He wasn't used to getting praise from teachers. "Oh, that was easy," he shook his head. "Sluggy told us how to do it in the lesson before. I just remembered it." "Bloody hell, you must have a brilliant memory then." Remus shrugged. He supposed that was true. His teachers at St. Edmund's had remarked more than once that he knew an awful lot of words for somebody so dim-witted. Sirius was staring into space now, clearly deep in thought. Remus could practically see the cogs working in his mind. Sometimes, Sirius was an entirely closed book. Other times, he was so easy to read it was almost funny. "If you could read, you'd be as good as me and James. Better, probably." Remus snorted. So modest, Black. "Well, you would." Sirius missed the sarcasm completely, still looking thoughtful. "Your wand work is much more natural, and if your memory is as good as you say it is. He chewed his lip. I bet there's a spell for it. Remus laughed. You're gonna cure me with a spell? Why not? Remus had thought about it already. Of course he had. But he was more aware of the limitations of magic than anyone. After all, he had scars which could not be healed, and a monthly nightmare which no one could prevent. Magic can't fix stuff like that, he replied bluntly. Why else does James wear glasses? I think there are spells for eyesight, Sirius said. Maybe they're just not worth the effort, or too dangerous, or complicated or something. It's not just the reading, Remus counted. My writing's crap too. I'm too slow, and it comes out all messy. There are definitely spells for that, Sirius said confidently. You can bewitch your quill. I've seen my father do it on official documents. His handwriting's really scratchy normally. Remus was at a loss. Sirius clearly wasn't going to give up. He chewed his lip. Why are you so interested in it anyway? You're my fellow marauder. We can't have you in detention every day. What if the Slytherins strike back? We'll need your evil mind for pranks. His eyes glittered. Speaking of, I'm assuming you haven't done your history homework yet. Nope. Okay, let's get started. Sirius jumped off the bed and began rooting around his trunk. No, you're not doing my homework for me, Remus protested, standing up himself, folding his arms. Too bloody right I'm not, Sirius replied, withdrawing a heavy book. It was History of Magic. Remus recognised the size and shape. I just fancied refreshing my memory, that's all. So I'm going to sit here and read it aloud because that helps me study. And if you happen to retain some of it in that enormous brain of yours, then there's not much I can do about it. Remus huffed. Haven't you got something better to do? Where's James anyway? Watching the Gryffindor Quidditch practice, Sirius settled down on his bed, opening the book. Reckons he'll get on the team next year, so he's trying to pick up some tips. Peter's followed him, obviously. Now, be quiet, please. I'm trying to work. He cleared his throat. A History of Magic by Bathilda Bagshot. Chapter 1, Ancient Egypt, the Rites and Rituals of Inaped. And he went on, and on, and on. Remus stayed standing for a while, trying to decide whether or not just to walk out the room and slam the door, but he found that he really wasn't that angry. It was difficult to stay angry with Sirius, no matter how annoying he was. So Remus sat down and listened. It turned out that history wasn't that boring after all, not when you understood the basics. Plus, Sirius was considerably more animated than Professor Binns. His voice was clear and steady, never stumbling over the more complicated words or phrases, as if he had read the book 100 times. Remus had once heard him tell James that he was fluent in Latin and Greek, the Black family apparently taking pride in that sort of thing. On he ploughed, chapter after chapter, from the gory Egyptian resurrection charms to the cryptic Greek oracles to the magical Mesopotamian priestesses. The ancient world opened up in Remus's mind, and he found himself lying back on his bed, arms behind his head, with his eyes closed, letting Sirius lead him through time. Eventually, the other boy's voice was almost hoarse, and he spoke just above a whisper. Evening had closed around them, and the common room was bathed in a golden orange glow as the sun set. Halfway through Chapter 5, Tiberius and the Advancements of Roman Battle Magic, Sirius let out a quiet cough and put down the book. I don't think I can study any more today, he croaked. Remus's eyes snapped open. He sat up blinking. That's okay, he said quietly. It's dinner now. I'm starving. They both got up, stretched, and headed downstairs. James and Peter were waiting for them at the Gryffindor table in their usual seats. How was practice? Sirius asked, after draining a goblet of pumpkin juice. His voice had almost returned to normal, only sounding slightly strained. Crackin', James replied cheerfully, spearing a sausage on the end of his fork and using it to scoop up some mashed potato. How come you didn't come? Homework, Sirius replied, pouring gravy over his own mash. As they finished their dinner, James regaled them with a blow-by-blow account of the Quidditch practice, listing every player on the team, their strengths and faults, their techniques, and what he would do to improve them. Peter interjected occasionally with his own opinions, which barely differed from James's. Pudding was millionaire shortbread, which neither Sirius or James liked. Remus thought they were mad, and took their distaste as evidence of their snobbery. He'd have eaten theirs too, but Peter got there first, scoffing the lot. "I've got some sweets," the smaller boy offered, digging in his robe pockets and withdrawing a bulging brown bag. "Mum sent them. Help yourself." "Cheers, Pete." They dug in, munching their way through fizzing Whizbees, chocolate frogs, and flavour-changing gobstoppers happily. Remus helped himself to a few as well, until they all felt quite sick. "What homework were you doing?" James asked, scratching his chin distractedly. "I thought we'd finished everything for this week." "Yeah, I was behind on history. Had to go back and check something." Sirius was scratching too, near his collarbone. Watching them made Remus start to itch. The back of his hand tickled as if a small insect was crawling over him. He suddenly thought of the itching powder and looked down. He nearly screamed. The back of his hand was growing dark, thick hair at an alarming rate. He was transforming. It wasn't anywhere near the full moon. How could this be happening? He stood up so suddenly, he nearly fell backwards. He had to get out of there, fast. "What's up, Lupin?" James stared at him, startled. Remus looked back at him, then at Sirius. They were both growing hair too. Dark curls sprouted from their faces, their hands and arms, every bit of exposed skin. He gaped, speechless. He ran his tongue over his teeth. They weren't getting any longer. "Oh, bloody hell," James said, looking down at himself, then at the other two boys. "What's going on?" "Peter," Sirius growled, his face now almost covered in hair. "Are you sure your mum sent you those sweets?" Peter, who hadn't had any sweets yet, stared at them both and turned red, spluttering. "Well, I mean, I thought they were from her. They arrived this morning." "Pete!" James roared. People were looking at them now, turning and nudging each other. Soon the entire dining hall was whispering and pointing at the three incredibly hairy boys at the Gryffindor table. Plenty of people were giggling too, but of course no one was laughing louder than Severus Snape over by the Slytherin benches. "Come on." Sirius stood up, sticking his furry nose up, with an air of aristocratic dignity that was nothing short of hilarious. "Let's get to the hospital wing. We can plot our revenge later." As they left to howls of laughter from the rest of the Great Hall, Remus cringed in shame, covering his face with his hands. Every inch of him was now covered in the same glossy black hair. He didn't find it as funny as James and Sirius seemed to. "Told you they'd strike back," Sirius muttered.